Everything you were taught about the Aztecs might be a lie built on top of a lie. And the proof isn't hiding in some dusty book. It's hiding inside human blood. If this story pulls at you even a little, do one thing for me. Say the word Aztlan in the comments before you finish watching. Not because I'm asking for engagement, because that word is the beginning of a mystery, and I want to know you're standing at the start of it with me. For hundreds of years, we've been told a simple story. The Aztecs were a mighty empire. They built a floating city in the middle of a lake. They worshipped the sun. They practiced human sacrifice. Then the Spanish came, and the empire fell. That's the version in textbooks. That's the version in movies. That's the version most people carry in their heads without ever questioning it. But here's the problem. That story was written mostly by the people who destroyed them. Think about that for a second. Almost everything we know about the Aztecs came from Spanish priests, Spanish soldiers, and Spanish record keepers, writing decades after the conquest, translating a culture they didn't understand, using a language they barely spoke, filtered through their own fears and their own religion. It's like asking the person who burned down a house to describe what the house used to look like. And now, something is happening that those old records never expected. Scientists are pulling ancient DNA from bones, teeth, and burial sites across Mexico, and what the DNA is showing is not the clean, simple story we grew up with. It's something stranger, something older, something that stretches the identity of the Aztec people far beyond the borders we were taught. To understand why this matters, we have to go back to the beginning. Not the beginning the Spanish wrote down, the beginning the Aztecs themselves believed in. The Aztecs called themselves the Mexica. That name still lives today, hidden in plain sight, inside the word Mexico. According to their own legends, the Mexica did not start in the valley where their great city stood. They said they came from a mysterious homeland far to the north, a place called Aztlan. Nobody knows exactly where it was. Nobody has ever found it. Some say it was an island. Some say it was a marsh. Some say it never existed at all and was more spiritual than physical, a symbol of origin rather than a real spot on a map. But the Mexica believed they left Aztlan and wandered for generations, guided by a god who told them to keep moving until they saw a sign, an eagle standing on a cactus devouring a snake. When they finally saw that vision on a swampy island in Lake Texcoco, they knew they had arrived. That is the spot where they built their capital city, Tenochtitlan. That eagle and that cactus are still on the Mexican flag today. So already, before we even get to the empire, before we get to the pyramids and the gold and the conquest, there is a mystery sitting right at the foundation. A wandering people, an unknown homeland, a journey that may have taken over 100 years. Historians still debate how much of this story is literal history and how much is myth shaped to justify their right to rule. And that uncertainty is exactly where the DNA story begins to matter. For a long time, historians simply grouped the Aztecs into the larger label of Mesoamerican civilization, almost as if they had always been there, always been the same people, unchanged and isolated. But ancient DNA studies are starting to reveal a very different picture, a picture of migration, mixing, movement across huge distances, genetic threads connecting central Mexico to populations much further north, and even hints of deeper ancestral roots, stretching back to the earliest humans who crossed into the Americas thousands of years before any pyramid was built. This is where the story stops feeling like ancient history and starts feeling like a detective case. If you're starting to feel that itch, that need to know where this goes, you're not alone. Keep watching, because the next part is where the official story really starts to crack. Here is the version most people believe. The Aztecs were the descendants of a single unified group, always living in central Mexico, always speaking the same language, always following the same bloodline, until the Spanish arrived and mixed everything up. Pure Aztec blood before conquest, mixed blood after. But that idea, the idea of a pure, isolated bloodline before Europeans ever set foot in the Americas, is starting to fall apart. Genetic evidence suggests that Mesoamerica, long before the Spanish ever sailed anywhere near it, was already a place of deep mixing. Different groups from different regions moved, traded, married, and blended for centuries. The Mexica who built Tenochtitlan were not some untouched original tribe. Some researchers believe they were latecomers to the valley, outsiders who arrived after other civilizations were already established, and who had to fight, negotiate, and intermarry their way into power. That single detail changes everything. It means the Aztec people were never one simple bloodline to begin with. They were already a blend, a fusion, a patchwork of ancestors from different origins, long before any European ship crossed the ocean. And that raises an uncomfortable question. If the Aztecs themselves were descended from multiple ancient groups, all merging together over centuries, then what does it actually mean to say Aztec DNA? What are we even measuring? This is the exact question that modern genetic researchers are trying to answer, and it forces us to look even further back, past the Aztecs, past their wandering myths, all the way to the very first people who ever reached the Americas. Most scientists agree that the earliest ancestors of indigenous peoples across North and South America came from Asia, crossing into the continent during the last ice age, likely across a land bridge that no longer exists today, where the Bering Strait now sits. Once they arrived, over thousands of years, these early populations spread out, split apart, adapted to new environments, and slowly became the incredibly diverse indigenous nations that existed across the Americas by the time Europeans showed up. The Aztecs were one branch, one twig, on an enormous ancient tree of human migration that started long before Tenochtitlan was even a swamp with a dream attached to it. So when someone says the Aztecs, we have to ask, which layer of that tree are we even talking about? The deep, ancient ancestry from thousands of years ago? The specific groups who lived in the valley before the Mexica arrived? The Mexican migrants themselves? Or the generations of mixing that happened after conquest when Spanish, Indigenous, and eventually African ancestries collided and combined across Mexico? Because the DNA doesn't lie, but it also doesn't simplify. It shows layers. It shows a long, complicated story of humans moving, surviving, mixing, and adapting again and again over thousands of years. If your idea of the Aztecs is starting to feel bigger and older than you expected, that's exactly the point where I want you to pause. Picture this like an ancient river with many smaller rivers flowing into it. Now stay with me, because the next part goes somewhere heavier. When the Spanish arrived in 1519, they didn't find a simple single kingdom either. They found something the old story often skips over: enemies of the Aztecs. Tenochtitlan sat at the center of a huge network of city-states, some loyal to the Aztec ruler and some who deeply hated Aztec rule because the Aztec Empire demanded tribute and sometimes captives for religious sacrifice. One of those resentful groups was the Tlaxcalans, a powerful rival nation who saw the arrival of Hernan Cortés not as an invasion to fear, but as an opportunity to strike back against a hated enemy. Let that sink in for a moment. The fall of the Aztec Empire wasn't just Europeans against indigenous people, it was also indigenous nations against indigenous nations, with European weapons and European diseases tipping the balance in a conflict that already had deep local roots. This detail matters enormously for the DNA story because it means the genetic mixing of Mexico didn't start as a simple two-group story either. It wasn't just Spanish plus Aztec, it was Spanish plus Aztec plus Tlaxcalan plus dozens of other indigenous nations, all with their own distinct ancestral histories, all blending together over generations into what we now broadly call Mexican identity. And there's another layer that history books often leave out entirely. Enslaved Africans were also brought to Mexico during the colonial period, and their descendants became part of this genetic story too. Some modern Mexican populations carry African ancestry passed down from that era, a piece of the puzzle that rarely makes it into the simplified version most of us learned. So the real ancestry of modern Mexican people, and the deeper ancestry of the Aztecs before them, is not a straight line. It's a woven cloth made of many different ancient threads, some indigenous, some European, some African, some going back to the earliest migrants who ever crossed into the Americas. This is where the emotional weight of this story really hits, because for centuries, colonial systems in Mexico tried to rank people based on how much Spanish blood versus indigenous blood they had. It was called the casta system, a cruel social ladder based on ancestry, where lighter mixed ancestry was treated as more valuable, and indigenous ancestry was pushed down, shamed, and erased. Generations of people were taught, directly or indirectly, to distance themselves from their indigenous roots, to feel like the Aztec side of their identity was something lesser, something to hide. And now, hundreds of years later, DNA is quietly undoing some of that damage. It's showing modern Mexican and Mexican-American families that their indigenous ancestry isn't a small, forgotten footnote. For many, it's a significant, undeniable part of who they are, written directly into their cells, impossible to erase no matter how many old social systems tried. If you know someone who has ever wondered about their own roots, this might be the moment to send them this video. Not because the algorithm needs it, because this story might actually mean something to them. Now here's where the mystery deepens even further and where historians still genuinely disagree. Some genetic studies suggest that certain indigenous populations in the Americas carry ancestral signals that are incredibly ancient, tracing back tens of thousands of years to very early human migrations that some researchers believe may have happened in multiple waves, not just one crossing. If that's true, it means the ancestors of the Aztecs and of indigenous peoples across the entire continent may have arrived in more complex patterns than the simple one migration story most of us learned in school. There are also unresolved questions about contact and movement within the Americas over those thousands of years. Trade routes, migrations, and cultural exchanges happened across enormous distances long before any Aztec empire existed. Genetic and cultural evidence suggests connections between very distant regions that most people never imagined were linked at all. None of this is settled science. Historians and geneticists are still debating the details, still refining the timeline, still uncovering new evidence with every ancient burial site studied. But the overall direction of the evidence keeps pointing the same way. The story is bigger, older, and more interconnected than the simple version most of us grew up believing. And that brings us to the deepest question hiding underneath this entire mystery. What does ancestry actually mean? Because here's the truth that DNA keeps revealing again and again in every culture, in every country, in every bloodline on Earth. There is no such thing as a pure people. Not the Aztecs, not the Spanish, not anyone. Every population in human history is the result of movement, mixing, survival, and adaptation, stretching back further than any written record can capture. The Aztecs believed they came from a mysterious homeland called Aztlan. Maybe they did. Maybe it was a real place we simply haven't found yet. Or maybe Aztlan was never meant to be a single dot on a map at all, but a symbol, a story the Mexica told themselves to explain their own long journey. Either way, the deeper truth might be even more powerful than the myth. The Aztecs weren't a people who appeared out of nowhere, fully formed, untouched by the world around them. They were the result of thousands of years of human movement across an entire continent. Ancient travelers from Asia, migrations across ice and land, centuries of mixing between different groups, rivalries, alliances, marriages, conquests. And then, after the fall of their empire, even more mixing, with Spanish colonizers and enslaved Africans, forming the ancestors of millions of people alive today. When you look at it that way, the Aztecs were never just one thing. They were a living record of human migration itself. A snapshot, frozen at one moment in a much longer, much older story that started long before Tenochtitlan and continues today, quietly, in the DNA of millions of people who may not even fully see themselves. So if you carry any part of that ancestry, if your family comes from Mexico or from anywhere across the Americas touched by this deep and tangled story, you're not just descended from the Aztecs in some simple textbook way. You're descended from an incredible chain of survival that stretches back thousands and thousands of years, through ice age crossings and civilizations, through empires that rose and empires that fell, through conquest and resistance. That's not a small inheritance. That's one of the longest, most resilient human stories on Earth, quietly living inside ordinary people in ordinary cities, going about ordinary lives, most of them never even told the full scale. Here's a question worth sitting with before this video ends. If the people who defeated the Aztecs and the people who wrote their history could rewrite an entire civilization's story, how many other settled histories are incomplete? Maybe the real story of the Aztecs was never really lost. Maybe it was just waiting quietly inside the bones and blood of their descendants, waiting for science to finally catch up and start asking the right questions. The empire fell. The city was destroyed. The old world the Mexica built with their own hands was taken apart, stone by stone, and buried under a new one. But the people never fully disappeared. They live on, scattered and mixed and transformed, inside millions of families who carry pieces of that journey. Maybe that's the real lesson hiding underneath this entire mystery. Empires can fall, cities can burn, written histories can be rewritten by winners. But ancestry, the actual biological thread connecting one generation to the next, is almost impossible to erase completely. It waits, quietly, for thousands of years, until someone, somewhere, finally asks the right question and lets the truth speak. If this story changed even slightly how you think about the Aztecs, don't let it end here in silence. Say it out loud in the comments. Tell me which part hit you the hardest. Because somewhere out there, someone is about to learn that the story they were taught was never the truth, and that moment deserves to be shared.